Welcome to lecture 10. The title of this lecture is The Trinity of Cultural Studies, particularly Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams and E. P. Thompson. And this is the last lecture of week 2, and as a part of the 4-week SWAYAM course on aspects of cultural studies. This lecture 10 aims at acquainting the students with the 3 prominent figures of the School of Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. And the theorist Bill Schwartz, in his 1994 essay called Where is Cultural Studies, refers to these 3 as the trinity of the founding fathers of cultural studies. In this lecture, therefore, we will discuss Richard Hoggart, particularly his text The Uses of Literacy, published in 1957, Raymond Williams, well known for his book Culture and Society, published in 1958, and the third one of the trinity, E. P. Thompson, for his book on the history of the working class, writing history from below, published in 1960. Briefly, we will discuss these 3 books as the founding testimonies or testaments of cultural studies. By understanding these 3 trinity of the founding fathers, students will find out the historical genesis or the theoretical or intellectual components of cultural studies. For example, how from Richard Hoggart's The Uses of Literacy in 1957, students would come to know how your own personal narratives, your autobiographical insights into the culture where you are living in can be part of serious research and can pave the way for serious studies and researches. Similarly, from Raymond Williams' Culture and Society, students will learn how there can be an anthropological perspective into the affairs of your society where you are a member. That is how today you have cultural anthropology as part of one of the areas of cultural studies. And the third one, that is E. P. Thompson, particularly when we discuss his text, we will come to know, or the students will learn, how there can be a subaltern perspectives or perspective from the below or history from below, which is called subaltern history by the Subaltern Studies Group, which was active in 1980s, headed by Ranajit Guha. So, that is how from this lecture students will benefit, and they would benefit to the extent of understanding the intellectual components of cultural studies, how anthropology, personal narratives, common people, all these things can become part of serious studies, as against the canonical studies or as against the strict boundaries, the subjective distinctiveness of traditional disciplines and traditional scholars. So, with this I will take you to my slide, so that you can understand how they were concerned with the rising issues in terms of consumerism, technology, media, working class people, their protests, domination, hegemony, as we discussed in the previous lecture. So, I will take you to my slide therefore. As you can see, Bill Schwartz in his essay called Where is Cultural Studies, published in 1994, page number 381, he refers to Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams and E. P. Thompson as the trinity of founding fathers. Obviously, he was criticizing them, but nevertheless he uses this phrase called trinity of founding fathers. And these three books, as I have already spoken about, were quite fundamental in understanding the cultural or the intellectual components of initial components of characteristics of cultural studies. You see, Richard Hogarth's book was named as The Uses of Literacy. Mostly people know his work by this, but the significant aspect of his book lies in the subtitle, which is called Aspects of Working Class Life, and with special reference to publications, particularly the media publications, print medias, and then you have the electronic media as we are also struggling with now, and entertainment, newer forms of consumer culture, media culture, technological culture, and how these affected the working class people, and these working class people were living in a city or the suburb called Wales, where Richard Hogarth was also a member. So, as an organic intellectual, he finds out the changing contours of his own city called Wales, and particularly the lifestyles of the working class people. As you can see, there are two parts. Part 1, an old order. So, they had oral tradition, they would not like to get into new culture, okay? And they were nostalgic, concerned about home culture, domesticity, traditional life. They were concerned about the generations, mother, father, and the neighborhood. So, this is the old order of life. But around the 1950s, Hogarth would see there is a steady change in his own city, and this is how he writes the part 2 called Yielding Place to New, invitations to candy floss world, the newer mass culture, mass art, like your the video games or the reels or the TikToks or the cinema complex and the mall and many other things. They are part of the mass arts. So, he wrote about the producer and the weekly family magazines and the commercial popular songs like you have today, right? You have all the world music at your hand, right? So, but that is how your life is also changing. And the newer mass art, sex in shiny packets, jukebox and spicy magazines, sex and violence novels, obviously urban culture also, the place of culture, a nostalgia for ideals. So, as you can see, Hogarth was concerned about this sudden and new change in the lifestyle of his own community, his people living in the same colony. And this he would substantiate more in intellectual way and theoretical way in this book called The Uses of Literacy. So, cultural theorists would therefore always look for, or they would always be alert on this kind of sudden change in people's social, cultural, religious, economic, technological spheres of life. That is how you understand or you take culture as part of the analysis beyond the economic factor or the mere structure of bourgeois and proletariat, working class and the master class, but all these can be viewed from the perspective of culture. And Richard Hogarth, see how he looks into this change very systematically, looking at family magazine, commercial popular songs and the all kinds of magazines, popular culture and other things. So, how do we understand the uses of literacy in theoretically? As you can see on your screen, he poses these questions in his book. He says, from this change we are forced to ask therefore, or learn therefore, or discern therefore, what relationship may there be between the old generation who were tolerant and the contemporary forms of the idea of freedom. Like, you as new generation, you would always demand for your freedom, your liberty, your choice of lifestyles. This new culture were arising in a place which was earlier inhabited by the old generation who lived with the older form of culture. The problem is not the rivalry between them. The problem is how this new culture is instigating the two generations. And we also ask the relationship, whatever it could be, between the older group sense and modern democratic egalitarianism. They would say we are living in a democratic country. There should be equality of choice, of lifestyles. So, this was the nation, the point of cultural conflict or conflict of lifestyles, thinking and ideologies between the old and the new generations in the city called Wales, where Richard Hogarth was a member. And we also ask between the older sense of the need to live in the present, to be happy with what is there with you, to concentrate on your present life, contrasted with the newer kind or idea of progressivism. That is how the new generation would always tell, we are progressive, we are liberal, we are democratic, we are dynamic, right. But Hogarth is not questioning whether their idea is good or bad. He is basically bringing in his personal insight or his personal analysis of how there is a cultural conflict, generational clash between the old people and the new people. The older form of social cohesion, trust, belief, faith, respect, satisfaction with life were eroding. In what ways, therefore, he has tolerance help the activities of the new entertainers. So, this cultural conflict, the shift in the old culture to new culture was something that he was talking about from personal angle, from autobiographical angle in this book called The Uses of Literacy, and how the working class people was suffering from it. And he goes on to ask in this book, Richard Hogarth, he says, can the idea of having a good time while you can really open the way to soul mass hedonism? In English literature, we talk about Epicureanism, that is eat, drink and make merry, or we talk about seize the day. When there is time, when you are young, you should enjoy your life. This is what is means Epicureanism, or which is called also hedonism. Now, Hogarth is questioning, are we then, while demanding progressivism, newer entertainment, lifestyle, magazines, songs, foods and other things, are we turning to be soul mass hedonism, depending on mass culture, mass consumerism? So, this is something that is negative that is happening. And he goes on to say, can the sense of the group be turned into an arrogant and sleek conformity? And this is what you should know, what is happening around us because of our newer form of food culture, dress culture, for demand for our own individual liberty, space and other things. We are becoming arrogant, we are becoming impatient. There are so many examples of, you can see, I will give a simple example how, some, boys who go to supply or to deliver food at your doorstep are attacked. And there are so many other kinds of social anarchy, social anomalies and conflicts that have erupted because of, in the name of progressivism or newer entertainments. Hogarth is questioning this again. Can a greater consciousness of these traditional virtues be developed into a destroying self-flattery? So, arrogance, conformity, having good time, hedonism, they are nothing but a kind of snobbery or self-flattery that we are indulging in. I mean, this is quite simple for you to understand how we have become very elitist, aristocratic or snobbish, fashionable and therefore arrogant and other kinds of social anomalies. And therefore, as against this, Hogarth tries to formulate a theoretical thing, a theoretical proposition. He says Hogarth's goal therefore was to create a research center that would combine literary and sociological approaches to develop new theoretical and methodological techniques for the study of popular culture. So, how to tackle these problems? Who will study these? Obviously, the old Marxist scholars would consider it to be trivial, because this has to do with the common people. They are not canonical things to talk about food, dress, entertainment, music and other things. But Hogarth therefore would say that we need to create a center that would combine both literature and sociology and their approaches to develop new theoretical and methodological techniques for the study of popular culture. Popular culture therefore becomes part of serious study or canonical studies. And that is the connection between cultural studies and popular culture, and Richard Hogarth would bring in this connection in a personal way, and that is how he is one of the the trinity of the founding fathers of cultural studies. And things have opened up. Now we are talking about food, about medicine, medical humanities. We are talking about all sorts of things under the ambit of cultural studies. As you saw on your screen, Richard Hogarth was trying to formulate a newer approach to deal with these new cultures, and how his own people in the same colony in Wales were struggling to grapple with these new kinds of cultures that they were engulfed with. Now, with this discussion on Richard Hogarth's The Uses of Literacy, now I will take you the next of the trinity of founding fathers, that is Raymond Williams. As you can see on your screen, Raymond Williams from 1923 to 1988, known for his book called Culture and Society, which was published in 1958, 1 year after Richard Hogarth's book called The Uses of Literacy. And particularly, I would prescribe you to read, I mean you can read the whole book, but particularly in the last chapter called conclusion chapter in the book called Culture and Society, he is talking about the cultural problems. Particularly, he is talking about what is mass, what is mob, what is mass communication, what is mass observation, how communication and community are related or impacted, and how influenced, and how culture and which way of life we should lead now, what is the choice in front of us. Like Hogarth was questioning the idea of community and the development of a common culture where everybody will be equal. So, these are basically some of the cultural aspects of this book called Culture and Society. So, this was anthropological in nature, because like Richard Hogarth, he was having his own insight into the living society in his city called Leeds. So, Hogarth gives autobiographical insight, Raymond Williams gives anthropological way of life, and he is emphasizing on creation of a common culture. And I am referring to this 1960 edition, and the page numbers are also given, you can read. Nevertheless, let us go to the next slide. Raymond Williams basically in this book talks about three kinds of culture. One is called dominant culture, in the sense the normative culture under which or in which sometimes we are forced, sometimes we are coaxed to live, and the residual culture, when there is a cultural change, slowly this majoritarian normative culture dissolves and a newer kind of culture emerges. But before the complete dissolution of this dominant culture, there will be certain residuals, remnants of the dominant culture, which is called residual culture, or resonance or residues of the past culture in the dominant culture. And also you have another kind of culture which is called emergent culture, completely newly emerging culture as confluence or contradictions of dominant and residual cultures. Think about how cyber culture or technology is a newer culture for people like us living in this part of the world. So, basically then we can't consider culture as something linear, monolithic, absolute or fixed or only one kind, but within the culture you have changes, you have shifts, you have newer kinds of culture, stratas of culture, dominant, residual and emergent. And in this chapter, again in this book, he is talking about how because of these cultural changes, how there will be different generational approaches to new culture, like Hogarth was talking about. And he says, I am quoting him, he says, culture is the product of the old leisured classes who seek now to defend it. The old generation will try to protect themselves from the new culture, which they would consider as destructive. Whereas, the new rising class or new generation, culture is the inheritance of the new rising class, which contains the humanity of the future. And this new class seeks to free it from the restriction of the normative or from the residual or from the earlier culture. So, the old generation would defend it, whatever culture was there, but the new generation would imbibe it, or they would ask for freedom to go or choose or to live or to embrace the new culture. But nevertheless, what you can see, there would be cultural conflict between the old and the new, or the old versus the new culture. So, as cultural critic or as an intellectual, we cannot be apathetic towards such varieties, such anomalies or such hierarchies of culture which were or which are prevalent outside our classroom or beyond the boundary of the university. So, this is where the role of the organic intellectual plays a significant part in bringing what is called people's culture, popular culture or mass culture or the cultural conflict outside the classroom into the classroom, and thereby the classroom becomes a laboratory both for the students and the teachers to ponder, to think and to formulate newer means, newer ways of dealing with these kinds of culture. So, Raymond Williams therefore prescribes, instead of having dominant residual emergent culture where the participants would clash with each other like the old and the new, we need a common culture. And this common culture is not for the sake of an abstraction, but because we shall not survive our life or life in the society unless we have egalitarian common culture where everybody is equal and a culture for everybody. There would be no cultural hegemony as Gramsci would talk about. So, again, who would promote this common culture? Common culture means culture is not about what is called good good literature or what is called good music or classical music. Culture is also not only music, not only book, but sports, but food, but dress, but technology, everything. So, that is called a common culture. In fact, Williams borrows this idea of common culture as a way of life or as a whole way of life from T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot talks about sports, talks about food and other things as to define what is culture. He says culture is a whole way of life, and that is how Williams is borrowing from him to talk about we need a common culture, not hierarchy of culture. You have popular culture, high culture, low culture, let there not be any hierarchy, rather we deal with common culture, and this common culture should be part of our studies. So, who would make it as part of these studies or who would promote this common culture? So, in chapter 2, Raymond Williams talks about this R.H. Tawney, and there he prescribes that we need an educational method to culture crisis. Why? He says any educational system will reflect the content of a society, an emphasis of the common need. This is what Williams writes in his 1960 edition, in page number 354. So, that is how Raymond Williams talks about, but nevertheless his book tells us or educates us in certain novel ways. And he says there have been two main results in ordinary thinking. This is what he is telling when he is decoding the cultural mentality of the people in 1950s, particularly his people around him. He says we have understood, we have learnt that something new about change, that society is changing, and that industrialism is not the permanent culture or the universal culture, that even industrialism is also, capitalism is also transforming. So, no culture therefore is static, there is a change. So, he was successful in exposing the changeability or the transient or the arbitrariness of culture. Otherwise, people thought culture is something static, it cannot be changed, it cannot be questioned. The second thing Williams contributes for our understanding, as he himself also understands, is that we have been given new illustrations of an alternative way of life. In this changing scenario of culture, what we need to do therefore responsibly is to think about, to be self-reflective, to be ethical inward look. For example, if you are exposed to the modern food culture and you do not like it, you can think of an alternative way only when you think how you can survive or how you can evolve your own way of life or choice. So, one therefore needs to be self-reflexive. One has to apply his own cognitive power and also ethical decisions or conscience to find an alternative way. And Aldous Huxley brilliantly talks about how you should use your conscience, whether you should be snobbish about things and choices, your cultures, or whether you can live in a middle path by using your conscience. So, this is this reflexive act therefore is a way to survive with this mass change of culture or the changing contours of culture. So, you become self-reflexive and you need to have an ethical stand during this time. That is what Raymond Williams talks about. And then he says a culture can never be reduced to its artifacts, and brilliantly he gives example. The culture is not about your food, your bike or your computers or your cell phones or your TV towers or your trains or whatever you say, that is not culture, you cannot reduce it. For instance, he says working class cannot become bourgeois simply by acquiring cars. A mere possession of car or buying of car will not elevate a working class man to a bourgeois. So, to be a bourgeois, you need to have a car, but you also need to have a culture, ideology, that kind of cognitive or what is called mental sophistication, or you can say cunningness also. Similarly, a bourgeois cannot be bourgeois if they do not possess cars or washing machines. One can be, in other words, one can be bourgeois even without possessing cars or washing machines. So, from this example what we understand is artifacts are not markers of culture or your status. Besides these, you need to have a mental culture, ideology, in terms of thoughts, in terms of your cognitive power, right. So, this is how culture or intangible things, ideology, beliefs, faiths. So, these intangible rituals, intangible things become part of the dominant culture or any culture. And this is how Raymond Williams decodes the components or the nature of culture. And therefore, he says how culture functions. To decode this, you have to look at the nature of language, how language is part of production, distribution, consumption, or how language can be used for the cultural hegemony. And language functions in two ways, one is semiotic meaning, another is discursive. This is what basically Stuart Hall talks about in his book called Representations, and this is what is also echoed by Raymond Williams. So, culture is not artifacts, it is also language, faith, ideology and beliefs of people, and how these are promoted or coded or encoded, as Stuart Hall would talk about, through language. So, cultural studies therefore would also aim at decoding language, and he talks about that the one vital lesson which the 19th century had to learn, and learn urgently because of the very magnitude of its changes, was that the basic economic organization could not be separated and excluded from its moral and intellectual concern. So, he was adding this moral and intellectual concerns, which is part of culture, as the intrinsic part of the economic structure. So, together with Marx's idea of economy or economic structure and the moral, intellectual, the ethical, the imaginative aspects of people's lives are what constitute called culture. So, as you can see on your screen, Raymond Williams was trying to understand culture from an anthropological perspective, particularly how people in his area were responding to the newly emergent cultural issues, cultural experiences or cultural events, like Richard Hogarth was talking about his own people in Wales. Now, after discussing Raymond Williams, we will move to the next slide to talk about E. P. Thompson's contribution to the cultural studies. As I have already spoken about in the beginning of my text, E. P. Thompson is remembered for his contribution to the historiography, particularly including the common people, the working class people in the ambit of historiography, which as I have already spoken about, the subaltern groups in 1980s headed by Ranajit Guha would also talk about subaltern history with reference to India. So, that subaltern history is something which is the novel contribution of E. P. Thompson, when he would get into people's correspondences, letters, memoirs and other things, and try to write a new art of historiography. And that is how not only it was his content, but his novel way of novel genre, that is including personal narratives, letters, correspondences in writing historiography. So, let us go to the slide so that we understand what E. P. Thompson had contributed to the cultural studies. As you can see on your screen, E. P. Thompson considered the 1790 to 1830 period is the period of the formation of the working classes. And this is also the period 1790 to 1830 as the period of class consciousness. Let me see how in our own country there is a rise of class consciousness of students in our own time. So, consciousness is also specific to some time and space. As far as working class consciousness was concerned, it was from 1790 to 1830, as E. P. Thompson would write in his book called The Making of English Working Class People. And this consciousness would come as a cultural counter attack or reply, writing back to the dominant classes or the dominant interest of other classes. And there he speaks about, E. P. Thompson speaks about that this period also witnessed a steady growth of the corresponding forms of political and industrial organizations. So, you had trade unions, you had friendly societies, you had educational and religious movements, political organizations and periodicals, and you had working class intellectual traditions, working class community patterns and a working class structure of feeling. Pretty simple, like students en masse, irrespective of their positions in different places, have a kind of feeling now, feeling for their own predicaments, their rights, their choices. So, this feeling, or what is called working class consciousness, was the result of this period and which needed to be thought over, pondered over, researched into. And that is how he would research into the working class in England in 1960. And in the chapter called chapter 16, class consciousness, he defines what is class consciousness. He says, these working class learn to see their own lives as part of a general history of conflict, that they lived in a time and space where there were ideological conflicts, the bourgeois and the proletariat, the dominant class and the subaltern class, between the loosely defined industrious classes and the politicians also, the House of Commons. And he says this collective self-consciousness was indeed the great spiritual gain of industrial revolution, which aspired for a more humanly comprehensive way of life. So, when you talk about culture, we need to talk about the subaltern people, people from within, who prior to this were considered to be outside the ambit of the serious study or canonical studies. So, we have subaltern studies, and we have so many essays on peasants, on marginal groups, on common people. We have so many papers modeled after many newer and many strange and many interesting issues, whether you call it medical science, medical humanities, digital humanities, folk studies, food studies. All these are the result of the cultural studies, and these subjects would spread, or scholars, intellectuals, institutions would accept or introduce these areas because of their awareness of cultural studies and how they learn from Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson, that these can also be part of serious studies. So, I will show you the references which you can refer to and read more on your own and come back to me for further questions. As you can see on your screen, these are the references. Particularly these books are available in internet. You can obviously download it and read it. In case of any queries, you can come back to me. Nevertheless, with this, I would like to thank you for being patient in listening to me. Thank you very much.